Muraho,
Hoi.
Hola.
ahlan wa sahlan.
Ahoy.
Sveiki.
Привет.
Hello.
Ciao.
Salut.
Hello.
And welcome to Policy Voices by Friends of Europe, an independent think tank with a difference. Each week from Brussels, we bring you powerful conversations with policy voices from around the world. Policy Voices talking policy choices.
Hi, I'm Catarina Vila Nova, host of Policy Voices. Just a quick note before we start today's episode. Starting next week, Friends of Europe is bringing you a 5-part special EU election series. From Monday to Friday, we are publishing one episode per day on key election topics: European security and defense, artificial intelligence, climate change and the green transition, migration and fundamental rights, and the EU budget and the cost of living. I spoke with representatives from 5 parties and asked them where they stand on each topic and what policy proposals they will put forward in the next mandate. I spoke with heads of communication, secretary-generals and MEPs from the European People's Party, ALDE, the Party of the Socialists and Democrats, the Greens and the Left. We're doing this to help you make an informed decision when you go to the polls. The first episode is coming to your feed already on Monday, so don't forget to subscribe to our podcast to be notified as soon as the episodes are available. That's it. Enjoy today's show.
Ukraine is at war with Russia, or Russia is at war with Ukraine, I should say. And as long as that war is going on, I do not see a formal invitation for Ukraine to become a NATO member coming. So I'm very much afraid that formal invitation will not be forthcoming in Washington. I do not see it happening.
Hello and welcome to Policy Voices, Friends of Europe's weekly podcast on European and global affairs. I'm your host, Catarina Vila Nova. In today's episode, I'm speaking to Jaap de Hoop Scheffer, former Secretary General of NATO, whom you heard at the start of the show saying that as long as Russia is engaging in war with Ukraine, Ukraine has no chance of joining the military alliance. This means no formal invitation to join in the upcoming NATO's July summit in Washington. The former NATO chief spoke candidly about Ukraine's slim chances of joining the military alliance that were first put on the table in 2008 during the Bucharest Summit when Scheffer was then NATO's chief. Looking back on that period, Scheffer admits that it wasn't NATO's finest hour because it made a promise to Ukraine that it knew it could not deliver. Scheffer now warns the European Union to not follow the same path of NATO, as talks to kickstart formal negotiations over Ukraine joining the EU are set to start as soon as next month. Here's my conversation with Jaap de Hoop Scheffer, former Secretary General of NATO. Jaap de Hoop Scheffer, hello and welcome to Policy Voices. Thank you so much for joining me today. How are you?
Pleasure. I'm fine. Great to be able to record the podcast on a very important topic called Ukraine and the war, of course.
Exactly. And you are joining me today on the show as a preview of the Ukraine Security Forum that Friends of Europe is organizing next week. During this event, we'll be launching a new report by Paul Ames, the former NATO correspondent at the Associated Press, titled Cost of Inaction, which lays out scenarios and their impacts as the war in Ukraine continues. And the last few days have been demoralizing, to put it bluntly, for Ukraine, as it has been forced to pull back its troops from several villages in the border region of Kharkiv, following continued pressure from Russian forces. And on the other side of the border, very interesting developments as Vladimir Putin replaced the longtime defense minister Sergei Shoigu with the economist Andrei Belosov. What is your assessment of these latest developments?
Well, my assessment. Let's go to the front first, and the risk of further Russia in attack mode, the Russian Federation in attack mode. Kharkiv is not that far from where the fighting is now taking place. The reason for it, and we should be honest with ourselves, is that as we speak, the Ukrainian army, the soldiers are still fighting with one hand tied behind their back. And that is because we do not yet have the political audacity or guts to allow them to change their limited maneuver possibilities, and more specifically, their limited possibilities in firing longer range missiles into Russian territory. I do agree with David Cameron, the British Foreign Secretary, who said about 2 weeks ago that this should be possible. But I realize at the same time that in the European Union and in NATO, there is no consensus between allies. I mentioned NATO, not because NATO is directly involved, as we know. We should be careful here, because we should not give Vladimir Putin an argument that NATO is at war with him. He's at war with Ukraine. He is driving a war of aggression against Ukraine. But when you look at the position taken by important allies, Cameron's view is not shared by all. Perhaps I should say not shared by many. On the Russian internal front, my concern has increased by this reshuffle and the change of position of Shoigu and the new appointment. And that is that my conclusion from this is, and I'm not the only one, that is that Vladimir Putin is going for the long haul and is preparing in full preparation for a war economy. He has already, of course, made the switch, and I think this nomination is a signal and a sign that he is going for the long haul. I always have said Ukraine is the main prize, but Putin will certainly not stop with Ukraine. And when I use the word concern, it's a mild expression for what I'm afraid of, and that is in the longer run, might be 3 years, might be 5 years, might be 7 years, Putin will try to satisfy his obsession that he wants his empire back, and that NATO territory might be in danger as well.
And how concerned are you that, assuming that you are also not seeing that not only Ukraine, but Europe at large is not having the same mentality of a long run preparations for what is about to come? How concerned are you that the same similarity is not being seen in Europe?
Well, I'm concerned. We see that from the beginning. Let's start with the European Union. One cannot deny that the EU has done a lot. There's a lot of financial aid. There's a lot of military aid, though not enough. But to go one step further is politically not yet possible in some allies. I'm waiting with you and many others already for months now for a positive decision in Germany on the Taurus longer range cruise missiles, which Ukraine is in need of, very much in need of, in dire need of. But still, despite the fact that I have the impression that in the coalition in Germany, the Greens would support such a move, Chancellor Scholz is not yet ready. And that is just an example. There are other allies which could and should do more. Let me mention an ally like Greece with a very well developed armed forces, and I could mention others. The stamina of the European democracies is limited. The democracies have a sort of situation where they run out of political breath because they have elections every 4 or 5 years. And Ukraine, yes, a war of aggression. But there are other crises as well. Of course, we have a major crisis in the Middle East, Israel-Gaza. But my point is that if we keep the European project alive and intact, and that's as relevant for the EU as it is for NATO, if you want to keep that political process intact, which started just after the Second World War, as you and I know, I mean, we have to do more. And if we give Putin the chance to win, that will be the end of the Project Europe, the peace Project Europe, as you and I have known it in our different generations. So that's a big risk, and the same nuance in opinions you see in NATO. When NATO, again, I repeat, is of course in the position that NATO is not as an alliance fighting Putin and fighting Russia. NATO is assisting Ukraine where it can in its completely legal, legitimate and rightful right of self-defense. And with David Cameron, I say self-defense can also well include, according to international law, that targets on Russian soil, on Russian territory, are attacked by Ukraine. The best example I can remember as far as targeting is concerned, should we accept that the Kerch Bridge linking mainland and Crimea, the annexed Crimea, illegally annexed Crimea. Is that bridge not a legitimate target? Are we afraid that Ukraine might hit that bridge, although it's becoming less relevant given the Russian positions? Is that a legitimate target? Is that not a legitimate target in our eyes? And is a maternity ward in Mariupol, and we all remember the horrible picture of the mother and the child, they both died. Is a maternity ward a legitimate target? I cannot explain that to my students at university. I cannot explain that to the men in the street here in the Netherlands.
I want to go back a few years to the Bucharest Summit of 2008, when you, of course, at this time, you were NATO Secretary General, and Ukraine and Georgia were first opened the door to enter the alliance ever so slightly. However, it's been 16 years since the Bucharest Summit, and the door for Ukraine to enter the alliance remains wide shut. How likely do you think it will be that Ukraine will receive a formal invitation to join the alliance in the NATO's July summit that it's happening in Washington?
Well, I'll answer the question, but briefly going back to Bucharest in 2008, that was not NATO's finest hour. It was not my finest hour either as Secretary General, because NATO made a promise on which it knew then, and it knows now, it cannot deliver. They will become NATO members, was the wording in the communique, and they was, of course, not only Ukraine but also Georgia. Now, leaving Georgia aside, which is in a very dire and difficult position at the moment, because there's also a dark Putin shadow over Georgia, given this new foreign agent law. But let me go back to Ukraine. NATO could not deliver. NATO made a promise which NATO should not have done, on which it could not deliver. And the situation, basically, fast forward to 2024, has not fundamentally changed. But now the situation is different. Now Ukraine is at war with Russia, or Russia is at war with Ukraine, I should say. And as long as that war is going on, I do not see a formal invitation for Ukraine to become a NATO member coming, which is giving Putin his way, of course. But the facts are that then in 2008, President George W. Bush was a strong supporter for Ukraine in NATO. It was membership action plan, not yet membership, but anyway. And now, if you look at the present administration under Joe Biden, I don't hear the American president making strong pleas for Ukrainian membership. I hear those pleas. I hear them mostly from Central and Eastern Europe, from the Baltic states. But I think if you would now go around the alliance after the Vilnius language, which basically said NATO's most recent summit, Vilnius basically said, as long as there's a war going on, you will not get an invitation. It was, of course, a more polite formula in the communique. And the big question now is what will happen, as you referred to the Washington summit already, coming July, around the corner, basically, what kind of language NATO will find in Washington to find the plus over the Vilnius language, because you cannot simply repeat Vilnius in a situation where Ukraine is in a worse position than it was at the Vilnius summit on the military front. So when I go around and listen to what I'm hearing in Brussels at NATO headquarters, this is a knot, political knot, which does not see yet the beginning of being untangled. I don't see that happening, so I'm very much afraid that formal invitation will not be forthcoming in Washington. I do not see it happening.
Going back to your initial statement when you were answering my question, was NATO's mistake then in 2008 to make a promise you could not keep in your words, or was the mistake that it took so long to never fulfill a promise? Should Ukraine have joined already to avoid what happened 2 years ago?
That's almost an unanswerable question. But again, I'll since you ask it, I'll try to give it some form of an answer. In 2008, the argument still was that there might have been a majority in Ukraine between the Ukrainian people to join NATO, but there was also lots of opposition. 2008. I mean, we have gone through 2014 and what have you. It might well have been that if Ukraine would have entered NATO earlier, Putin would have started its war earlier. It might well have been that Ukraine in NATO would create a deterrent effect vis-a-vis Putin that he would not have started. I do not know. The only thing I know is that Putin has an obsession, and I met him many times, although quite some time ago, but he's still the same Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. He has an obsession that Ukraine is not a state, not a nation, but just a territory. And that territory belongs to Russia, is Russian territory. So I do not know if it would have made a huge difference. And going back to our NATO side, given the fact that then in 2008 and across the period between then and now, there was no consensual NATO-Russia policy. There was a difference in approach. I mean, the Baltic states and Poland have a completely different approach vis-a-vis Ukraine, vis-a-vis Russia, I should say, than, for instance, France and Italy, let alone Germany, which has given its past a very complicated relationship, a difficult relationship, a sensitive relationship with Russia. So again, that's why I said NATO could not deliver. Also in the intermediate period, again, fast forward to now, to 2023, Vilnius 2024, there is no consensus. And the President Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg is walking on thin ice and has a limited margin of maneuver, knowing that there is no consensus. Putin knows very well there is no consensus. And that makes us relatively weak. And why does it make us relatively weak? Because if I look at least at this part of Europe, I'm from the Netherlands, as you know, we only have stability and peace in our DNA. I mean, the word war was a sort of taboo in the Netherlands, in Germany, and then it was about Afghanistan. No, Afghanistan was we were rebuilding that nation until the military came back in body bags, and then some people said it might be a war. War is not in our genes, not in our DNA. And that's why I said earlier in our conversation, democracies have a sort of self-deterring mechanism. And that self-deterring mechanism is the reason that we have so much trouble in answering the question, should Ukraine become a NATO member or not?
And of course, as you said before, the argument against Ukraine joining is, of course, because it's a country at war. But against this, many critics say that it provides only ammunition to Vladimir Putin to not stop the war, because as long as Ukraine is at war, as long as Russia is at war with Ukraine, Ukraine will never join the alliance. And on this, some suggestions that have been put on the table is that only certain parts of the Ukraine territory could join, similar to what happened in 1955 when only West Germany joined NATO for obvious reasons. Could a similar scenario be applied here? Do you see this as a possibility, or it's a scenario of it's either all or nothing?
I do see this as a possibility. The but, of course, which immediately follows, is that this would never happen against the will of the Ukrainian government. If we go back into history, I could refer, you did that indirectly, to Western and Eastern Germany. West Germany joined NATO, promised not to take East Germany by any kind of force. You have the Northern Territories in Japan. There are other examples. So my answer to your question is, I could, but at the moment, theoretically, imagine such a solution would come about after negotiations. Ukraine should agree, and we would, of course, never recognize the annexation of Crimea and Donbass, and recognize Russian gains, physical gains, territorial gains on the territory of which is now Ukraine. But again, I mean, the big if, of course, here is that I do not see any political margin of maneuver when we would impose this on Ukraine. And the second element is that I do not see an argument on the side of the aggressor, Vladimir Putin, to bring this about. Now he sees that he can make territorial gains on the battlefield because the West is wavering in its support for Ukraine.
And let's say that Ukraine does join NATO while it's still at war. How would Article 5 be applied if a country that is already at war then joins the alliance?
Well, you give now the excellent argument why Ukraine is still not a NATO member. Because even in the scenario we discussed a moment ago, there would of course be this same question: what's happened? What does happen if Putin sets a foot on what then would be a rump Ukraine without Crimea and without Donbass? So that's why I think it's a very remote possibility. But the allies are asking themselves the same question as you're now asking me. I do not know what would happen. I do not know what will happen if exactly what will happen if Putin would make a move now against NATO territory. Of course, I go from the assumption that then Article 4, Article 5 would be fully triggered. But in the scenario you are now describing, I would not know exactly what happened. I would not dare to predict what would happen.
If we put on one plate of the scale Ukraine's membership, and in here I'm thinking not just NATO but also EU, it's also on the table, of course, and on the other plate the continued support to win the war, which should be given priority? Or do you think that once Ukraine does win the war, the other two, membership of both blocs, will follow immediately?
Well, I think the European Union should avoid to make the same mistake as NATO has made in 2008, as I explained earlier, and that is making promises you cannot fulfill, and you can't fulfill those promises. So Ukraine, now having become a candidate member of the European Union, should be taken seriously in that ambition. And I know that has all kind of complications with other nations in the waiting room in the Western Balkans. I would also ask your attention for the position of Moldova, very, very vulnerable, poor country, which I think we should pay more attention to than we do as we speak. So I think the whole EU trajectory, complicated as it is, because the EU cannot grow to 34, 35 without a formal restructuring of its decision-making machinery. Do not forget that the EU treaty has a military assistance clause, which is even stronger than Article 5 of NATO. People tend to forget this, but there's also a military element and a military assistance element in the EU treaty. So I think the EU trajectory should go on. I think at the end of the day, Putin might be more afraid of the European Union coming close to his Russian borders than NATO. He knows very well that NATO will not wage war against Ukraine. But what happens if the EU, if the rule of law, if governance, if democracy comes close to his borders? Then he's in trouble. He might be in trouble. If Ukraine would develop as Poland has developed since the end of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. So my answer to your question is that trajectory, the EU trajectory, should be taken very, very seriously, despite all the difficulties, all the hurdles one could try to find, and the problems we already see when it concerns Ukrainian grain exports and angry Polish farmers blocking borders and what have you. So it's very complicated. But it's very important that that EU dossier is treated very, very seriously.
Perhaps that would be a somewhat positive sign if we are not in an election year. The entire union is going to the polls roughly 1 week after we launch this episode. After listeners are listening to this. And the polls are not optimistic at all. They show a significant shift to the far right, which will have repercussions, of course, as well in how the next commission will be built, taking into account that the far right leaders across Europe, and of course in here I'm thinking of Orban, the first EU leader that was seen shaking hands with Putin since he invaded Ukraine. Considering all of this, how concerned are you that that this support for Ukraine will waver. And here I also, of course, want to link to the event and the report that Friends of Europe will launch, called The Cost of Inaction. What will be then the cost of inaction for Ukraine and for Europe?
Those costs will be huge, absolutely huge. I share your analysis that we see, and we have in the Netherlands now a government which will be led by an extreme right party, the PVV of Mr. Wilders. Unimaginable not that long ago, but still. You mentioned Hungary. Of course, I very much hope that Prime Minister Fico will survive the horrible attack on his life. I hope that very much. I wish him speedy recovery. But if you look at Orban, you look at Slovakia, if you look at the Sweden Democrats, if you look at Wilders, Alternative für Deutschland, Marine Le Pen, Bardella in France, the union is also a not only outside powers, Russia, China, on trade, the United States of America, trying to influence the processes in the European Union. It is a process from within, and I very much hope that at least on the basis of the elections coming June, the democratic bloc of Christian Democrats, liberal social Democrats, Greens will keep a majority, and that's the shift to the right will not be as serious as some polls might predict. On a more positive note, in my opinion, and I follow the EU for a long time now, the European Union always develops from crisis to crisis. Never waste a good crisis is written over the doorpost of the European Union. Nothing much seems to happen, but when there are crises, like we have seen the pandemic, the financial crisis, we now have a difficult one in the Middle East, but that's not our topic today. And we have the major war in Ukraine, where there's lots of room for improvement. I hope that the middle. But in politics, I've learned as a national politician, as an international politician, solutions always come from the middle, originate in and from the middle. And I hope that the middle in the European Parliament, the European Union, will remain strong enough. I mean, to guarantee that the flanks will not have a final say on any topic discussed inside the European Union. But if you ask me, are you concerned? Yes, of course I'm concerned. Because I see in my country, Mr. Wilders having 37 seats in Parliament of 150. And in opinion polls, I mean, he's even much stronger. That is a horrible prospect.
Whether the right and the conservatives would remain indeed the center of the parliament, it could be a whole other topic. But since I only have time for one last question, I couldn't let you go without asking you, of course, as former NATO Secretary General, who do you think will succeed to Jens Stoltenberg at the helm of the alliance? Your compatriot Mark Rutte, perhaps?
I think Rutte's cards are still very strong. But given the fact that we need consensus inside the alliance, and consensus is not there yet, if I'm well informed, it's still the same Mr. Orban in Hungary, who has a lot of spanners to throw into the wheels on many dossiers, is still not convinced. Position of Slovakia, I don't know, but I say again, I hope that Mr. Fico fully recovers. But Slovakia, following Orban, there's still a formal second candidate, President Iohannis of Romania, which has not withdrawn his candidacy, as far as I know. So, well, here the saying goes, it ain't over until the fat lady sings. The fat lady has not yet sung, not sung yet. But I still think that Mark Rutte would be an excellent SecGen. He's a very successful Dutch Prime Minister. The world knows him. He knows the world. He faces a very tough agenda inside NATO, with a war at 2 hours flight from Schiphol Airport here in my country. My cards are still very strongly on Mark Rutte, but no consensus yet. And let's wait for the fat lady.
Jaap de Hoop Scheffer, thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Thank you for staying on that side and listening to my conversation with Jaap de Hoop Scheffer, former Secretary General of NATO. If you want to comment on this episode, you can search for Friends of Europe on LinkedIn and X or send us an email. Our address is press@friendsofeurope.org. As always, don't forget to subscribe to Friends of Europe's podcast wherever you get your podcasts to never miss an episode of Policy Voices. I'm Catarina Vila Nova and I'll be with you again next week. Until then, goodbye.